Hey guys, so today we're going to talk about cell respiration. After talking about photosynthesis and learning how plants are able to take the sun's energy and store it into sugars, we're now going to learn about the process that cells now take the energy that was stored in these sugars and they break down the sugars in order to generate ATP, which can then be used for a multitude of other things. So as we just said, cell respiration is the process where the mitochondria is going to convert this sugar into the ATP that is needed by the cell. The equation below is one that, again, you'll have to memorize, but if you look closely, it actually looks like something that might look familiar to you guys. It's exactly the same as the photosynthesis equation. The only difference is that it's the complete opposite. So in photosynthesis, you might remember that we had glucose and oxygen being the products. Well, if you look at this equation, we have glucose and oxygen as the reactants. Both the same numbers, exactly the same, even 6 O2 molecules. Exactly the same though. And if we look at the products now in cell respiration, you'll notice that these were the reactants of photosynthesis. We have 6 carbon dioxide molecules, 6 water molecules, and ATP that is being generated. Now you might be thinking, well, I don't remember ATP being in the photosynthesis equation, but if you remember, light is needed in order for the reaction to happen, and light is the energy, or a form of energy in that part of the equation, and ATP is the energy, the same energy that was stored inside of these sugars. So in cell respiration, there are 3 parts that you guys are going to have to know. The first is glycolysis, and that is going to actually occur not inside of the mitochondria, it's going to occur outside of the mitochondria, inside of the cytoplasm. The second is the citric acid cycle. Another name for this, one that we will probably use more often, is the Krebs cycle. And lastly, we have the Electron Transport Chain. And the citric acid cycle and the Electron Transport Chain are 2 cycles that when we look at them a little bit closer, you guys in CP might not quite understand how similar these reactions are to the reactions that were in photosynthesis, but they're actually really, really similar. So those students, those friends that you have in honors, when we look at these, it's really nearly exactly the same. And we will do a web quest later this week that will highlight those similarities. Like you said a few minutes ago, glycolysis is the first reaction that happens in cell respiration. It's an anaerobic process, meaning that it does not require oxygen in order to occur. We'll talk about the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain are both aerobic processes. That means that they require oxygen in order to occur. So glycolysis, it takes place inside of the cytoplasm, as we mentioned on the last slide, outside of the mitochondria. And in it, the cell is able to generate a small amount of ATP. 2 ATP are produced through glycolysis. And what's left, in addition to that ATP, is pyruvic acid. And another name for that you might hear is pyruvate. That refers to just one of them. And another molecule called NADH. And you might say, oh, NADH, that sounds really familiar to NADPH. And that's because they have extremely similar roles. NADH, very similarly to NADPH, is an electron carrier. And it's going to safely carry electrons from the cytoplasm to the electron transport chain, which is happening inside of the mitochondria in a different location. Now, when we're looking at cell respiration, if oxygen isn't present at this point, at the end of glycolysis, remember that glycolysis doesn't need oxygen in order to occur. Well, if oxygen isn't present, then it goes through a different reaction called fermentation. And we're going to cover that a little bit later. So our discussion is going to be focused on if oxygen is present. So the pyruvic acid that we mentioned in glycolysis then goes to the mitochondria for the second part of cell respiration called the Krebs cycle. While the NADH, which picked up those high energy electrons, they're going to go to the mitochondria for the third part of cell respiration called the electron transport chain. That reaction happens in an area of the mitochondria called the matrix. As we said earlier, cell respiration needs oxygen in order to occur. And that's why the citric acid cycle, the next cycle, and again, guys, another name for that is the Krebs cycle. You might hear me referring to them as both throughout this PowerPoint. One of the reasons that I do is because I've seen both appear on MCAS, and I want to make sure that you guys are familiar with both terms. So the citric acid cycle takes place inside of the mitochondria. It actually happens inside of the inner membrane. So you might take a look at our diagram over here and you can see this inner membrane around the cell. That's going to be where the Krebs cycle occurs. And this process is aerobic. What that means, it needs oxygen in order to happen. Now during this process, the pyruvic acid is used to make the energy storage molecules ATP, NADH, and FADH2. Now ATP, we've already learned earlier that is going to be used for the cell for whatever it needs. Maybe it's muscle contraction, maybe it's active transport. There are a bunch of other things as well that it could be used for. NADH, we already said, it's carrying those high energy electrons and it's going to be going to the Electron Transport Chain, which happens in the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Lastly, we have FADH2. FADH2 is very similar to NADH. It actually carries more electrons than NADH, so it's able to generate a little bit more ATP. So those high energy electrons, their energy is going to be used to generate ATP in the electron transport chain, which we'll cover in a few minutes. The last output that you're going to notice listed here is carbon dioxide, and 6 molecules of carbon dioxide are produced, and that's a waste product. Our body actually, we breathe it out and it goes into the atmosphere, which is good because plants for photosynthesis need that carbon dioxide. And once it's absorbed through their stomata, the plants are able to use that carbon dioxide to make those high energy sugars that we talked about. Guys, I kind of already went over this on the last slide, but just a reminder that the FADH2 and the NADH are going on to that third part of cell respiration called the electron transport chain. And again, that only happens if oxygen is present. And lastly, guys, the carbon dioxide that was generated is a waste product that will get expelled into the atmosphere and eventually will end up in the plants for photosynthesis. So as we mentioned earlier, guys, the electron transport chain is happening in that inner mitochondrial membrane, the inner membrane of the mitochondria. And again, it's aerobic, meaning that it requires oxygen in order to happen. Feel free to use this chart here to help you guys remember it a little bit. Again, these vocabulary words, understanding them and their definitions are crucial to understanding biology and really understanding how these concepts and processes are occurring. So here we have the electron transport chain, and again, this is kind of a simplified explanation of it, but basically all you need to know is that the electrons that FADH2 and NADH had brought to the electron transport chain are given to the electron transport chain, and through that process, ATP is generated. That's all you guys need to know for your understanding. Your friends in honors are going to be learning a bit more. If you're curious, please take a look in your book. And check out some of the videos that we're going to be watching. We'll probably watch a portion of them, and you guys can kind of watch a little bit further to, again, learn a little bit more about the process if you're interested. Before we move on, one thing I did want to point out is that the FADH2 and the NADH that you see used here, and those electrons that they brought, those came from earlier in glycolysis where NADH was generated, and especially the NADH and FADH2 that was generated in the citric acid cycle. So especially in that one, there's a large amount of those molecules coming from there. So that's where those molecules are coming from. So all in all, we've made a total of 34 ATP is generated. We made 38 ATP, but we had to use a little bit of ATP during glycolysis in order to get the reaction started. So we net a total of about 32 to 34 ATP total. And during the process, water is also generated as a byproduct to this. And our body uses water for a multitude of other things, but it is a waste product here. Now again, guys, after the electron transport chain, we have now generated all of our ATP. That is the end of cell respiration. And by the time this is concluded, 1 molecule of glucose has helped the cell generate about 38 ATP. And it's actually a very efficient process, especially when you take into account the electron transport chain, where the majority of that ATP is being generated. So this diagram also is a great study tool. If you take a close look, it shows each one of these reactions, glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. It shows in the diagram where they're occurring, and it also shows everything that's being generated. You see the ATP being generated by each of these reactions, and you see the NADH and FADH2 being generated, as well as where those are going, where they are going next. So use this diagram as a study tool, and hopefully you guys learned a little bit about cell respiration today. Thanks.